Hello folks, so this is a video to describe three types of sword that are part of an evolution of swords that go from the 15th century through to the 17th century. So we're looking at the arming sword, the side sword and the rapier. Okay, so to begin with, the arming sword, the medieval one-handed sword, often used with a buckler and equally often used by itself on horseback or on foot, used obviously in war but also used in civilian life. As I've mentioned in one of my previous videos, it became fairly common in the 15th century, particularly in Italy, to loop the front finger over the quillon. Okay, so we've got one quillon, two quillons, cross guard made of two quillons. Okay, so looping the finger over the front quillon, and this is essentially to bring the point more in line and perhaps give a little bit more control to the blade for sort of finer fencing movements used either with the buckler or by itself. As a result of that, the arming sword developed a branch on one of the quillons known as a finger ring. Initially these appear around the beginning of the 15th century, around 1400, 1410, and then presumably because they thought it looked nicer, also you didn't have to worry about which way round your sword was when you grabbed it, they developed another finger ring on the other side. Okay, and this is the beginning of the development of a type of sword which is really suited, rather than necessarily being primarily a battlefield weapon, it's really suited to people who have no protection on their hands. So the first thing to recognise is that the medieval hilt, as I've mentioned many times before, doesn't really give very good protection to the hands. It's okay, it's better than some swords, it's better than no guard at all, but you do only have a simple cross guard. Clearly swords like basket-hilted broadswords or sabres, or indeed rapiers, as we'll see in a minute, have a lot more hand protection. It's a chicken and egg thing. We don't really know whether the hand protection developed because swords started to be carried more in civilian life in certain parts of Europe, or whether it was simply that warfare was changing and soldiers on the battlefield who were the type of soldiers to wear gauntlets, you know, for example, people using maybe pikes, bows, crossbows, early firearms, who couldn't necessarily wear gauntlets or even perhaps afford gauntlets, maybe wanted a bit more hand protection. We don't really know which way round it developed, but for whatever reason, and equally it may have something to do with the fencing styles in use as well. We've talked about guard positions, where in medieval guard positions tend to be the hand held back, whereas as you go forward in time you start to see more and more forward presented guard positions with the hand more vulnerable. But we don't know whether those forward presented fencing positions are because you've now got a hand guard or a better hand protection, or the better hand protection comes about because you've got the more forward presented fencing guard position. So it's a chicken and egg thing. All we can really say is that in the end of the 15th century and 16th century we start to see more hand protection on swords, and equally we start to see more forward presented fencing positions being used more often. Okay, so the basic arming sword developed two branches, and then I should also say that the falchion as well, which is another type of medieval sword, also got these additions. And falchions very often had what we call a knuckle bow, okay, which is a branch which comes round and protects the front of the fingers, as you'll see on a sabre, for example. And then the next addition to come in was what we call a side ring, which is a ring that projects out to the side here and protects the vulnerable side of your hand. And then, surprise surprise, we get another side ring added on the side. So really the earliest additions to the basic medieval hilt that we see are the finger rings, the side rings and the knuckle bow. Okay, and once you have what is essentially a medieval one-handed sword with any of these additions on the hilt, it tends to be called, in modern times, a side sword. Okay, so the side sword, really, what is a side sword? Well, first of all, I should say, side sword is not really a historical expression. In the 16th century, these swords were simply called sword, okay, because it was just a normal sword. So they didn't have a special name, so to speak. We do see the expression spada da lato, which is Italian for side sword, used in some early Italian texts. But they're really referring just to the sword that you wear at your side. It doesn't describe a specific type of sword in itself. However, in the modern world, we like to be able to give lots of different names to different types of sword and classify things. And so in modern museum curator circles and people who collect arms and armour, these weapons, which are like a medieval one-handed sword but with added hand protection, have tended to become called side swords. Now, the next thing to mention is what are called side swords tend to be the weapons that sit pretty much halfway between being a medieval one-handed sword and being a rapier. Okay, so how do they differ? Well, this is also complicated because a rapier is in itself a term which, although it was used extensively in the historical period we're talking about, so the 16th and 17th centuries, and in fact the term was still used in the 18th century, but I'll deal with that in another video. The rapier itself, although it was a word that was commonly used, it didn't always mean the same thing to different people in different places at different times. The term rapier was used extensively in England in the 17th century, for example, to refer to basically what this is. A very long-bladed, usually long-bladed, narrow and really a thrusting sword. It can cut, or it could cut if it was sharp. This is a blunt one. However, it's not really designed to give chops. You could push cut or you could pull cut with it. You might hurt someone if you hit them really hard on the fingers or the head and give them a bleeding wound, but you're not going to sever limbs with this. You're not going to cut anyone's head off or cut anyone's arm off with it. It is a skewering, thrusting weapon. And if we look at the handguard, it's very developed by this point. Okay, and you do get side swords with a hilt that is this developed. So imagine the blade of the medieval one-handed sword on the hilt of the rapier, and that would be called a side sword. So the side sword is essentially, in modern, the way we refer to it in modern times is essentially two things. It's either the sword that is halfway in the evolution between a medieval one-handed sword and a rapier, or it's what's essentially a rapier hilt, rapier type hilt. So this is a swept hilt, for example, on a more choppy cut and thrust blade. Okay, so there we have a medieval sword is a cut and thrust sword, almost always. There are some exceptions, with a simple hilt. A rapier is a primarily thrusting weapon with a developed hilt to protect your hand, and a side sword is somewhere between the two. Now, I should add a few appendices to those statements and also sort of caveats. So as I mentioned, the rapier was different things to different people at different times. If you look at Joachim Meyer's treatise from 1570, he's German, and he has something he calls the rapier. And what he calls the rapier actually is what most modern people would probably call a side sword. And he cuts very extensively with his weapon. Okay, so that's the first thing to say, is that rapier didn't always mean the same thing to different people. The next thing to say is that the side sword was often what we would call a side sword now was often the military version, or the more military version, or the cavalry sword version of a civilian rapier. So rapiers were carried in war, were used in war. However, there were beefier, more cut and thrust versions, and you can see examples in museums. and you'll see examples like this with a very narrow blade, which are very thrust-centric, and then you see broader ones which can clearly cut very effectively and thrust and are long. And they could be used from horseback as a cavalry sword very effectively to cut or thrust. Whether you want to call that a rapier or a side sword is completely subjective, and different people will disagree on that. So the terms side sword and rapier are very fungible. They're not easy to define, and not everyone will agree what they are. The next caveat to add is that although rapiers were very thrust-centric, or the classic rapier with a narrow blade was a very thrust-centric weapon, the rapier treatises, the famous ones, the popular ones of the time, for example Fabrice, Capoferro, Agrippa and so on, and Alfieri, do include cuts. And different masters, different rapier masters, or what we would call rapier masters, bearing in mind that most of these Italian rapier masters actually just called their sword a sword, they didn't necessarily call it a rapier. Some of them included cuts and considered cuts important, some of them considered cuts less important, but they all did concede that the rapier could give cuts, and that and some sources concede that cuts were actually used quite a bit in duels and in war, even though people were taught to thrust, and that the thrust was generally more fatal and more pure to their style of fencing. Okay, so even systems that teach to thrust as much as possible do generally concede that cutting is important, and cutting does happen a lot in real fights. Okay, so there we go. We've got the medieval one-handed sword, we've got the rapier, and then generally halfway in between that, either because it's got a cut and thrust blade, or because it sits in the sort of development time period between the two, is a weapon we call the side sword, which is mostly a modern term. The last thing I will mention briefly is there was another weapon in use at this time, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the basket-hilted broadsword. Okay, this is actually a backsword. Backsword simply means it's single-edged. It's got an edge on the front and a small false edge. That means it's edged just at the top here. And this is the sort of thing that was popular in England and certain parts of Europe as well. So for military use particularly, basket-hilted broadswords and backswords were still popular, even where someone might wear a rapier in civilian life. They sometimes might use one of these in war as a cavalry weapon, for example. And a good example is Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. Okay, in Italy they had a style of basket-hilted broadsword called a schiavona, and in certain other parts of Europe, in parts of Germany as well, basket-hilted swords were also popular. The famous fencing master George Silver talks a lot about the relative advantages and disadvantages of what he calls the short sword, because it's relatively short compared to a rapier of the time. The relative advantages and disadvantages of the short sword or backsword compared to the rapier, and he was not a fan of the rapier at all. Joseph Swetnam, for example, who's a little bit later, about 17 years later than George Silver, he was of a different way of thinking. He was English, but he was more pro-rapier, and he does talk a bit about the backsword, but he clearly preferred the rapier. But as we go into the 18th century, the rapier developed into the small sword, more or less, and the backsword retained its popularity. Okay, both as a military weapon and as a civilian and dueling weapon. So there we go. In the 16th and 17th centuries, you've got a development from the medieval one-handed sword through various types of side sword and rapier, and then running parallel to that all the way through, you also have the medieval sword developing a different type of complex hilt, and you could get this type of blade on this type of hilt. In a more, what some might argue, a more medieval style of swordsmanship, but with a developed hilt on. Okay, and incidentally, this example is modelled on an example from the Mary Rose, dating to 1545, so middle of the 16th century. Okay, there we go. Thank you.